and development, not only from the public sector, even though it's similar in terms of intensity to the US, it's actually much more fragmented than what it is in the US. This in part might be good because there's a little of competition between research groups, but at the same time, it can also create challenges in terms of maximizing the return and making sure that investments go to the most productive areas. And the third one, it's our inability to a certain extent.
Success. Okay. I'm so sorry.
No worries. And the third one, it's about the inability that we have to create the enterprises that are growing and that are really changing and making the structural change of the economy that in the US is happening, but not so much in the EU. So let me just give you some of the charts. So the first one, I don't know if you can see it well, but it's showing a little bit the R&D investment in the EU compared to different countries. So what you see there is that in Europe, we have remained, I will not say flat, but the slope of the curve is the flattest from all of them. So you see that South Korea has sharply increased its investment, also the US, also Japan, also China, that has already surpassed the EU. So in 2024, R&D investment in Europe was 2.2% of the GDP, while in China it was 2.4%, and in the US it was 3.5%, in Korea almost 5%. In Europe, we had the objective to increase already more than 20 years ago the level of investment in R&D from it was 2% at the time to 3%. What we see is that following the trajectory of the past 10 years, we will not manage to get there at all. So what you see there is if we continue the same trajectory as in the past, we will end up in 2035 at 2.4%, but the objective is to reach 3% by 2030. This is still, unstated objective of the European Union, endorsed by all member states, to achieve this 3%. And the light blue is the slope of change that we would need in order to achieve that goal. So you can compare, the delta difference between, how we are doing to how we will be. And this has remained stagnant in the last couple of years. And just to give you a figure, so that in order to be able to bridge that gap and reach the 3%, Europe would need to invest 134 billion per year. So, and this is really quite significant investment. Think of the European Framework Program, which is the largest public R&D investment in the world, that has 95 billion euro for 7 years. So this means that you would need to multiply that by 10. Then when we look a little bit at the composition of the R&D investment, what we see is that, okay, in terms of public R&D, the EU and the US more or less invest similar values, and the gap is really coming from the private sector. That's all. Our companies invest less in R&D. This is very much linked to the economic structure that we have in Europe, that is more focused on medium high tech industries, while in the US you really have, in the past years, this increase of those industries that are investing heavily in R&D, very much linked to the digital revolution, so all the digital enterprises. And on top of that, what we see is what I was mentioning, that the public R&D investment, to a certain extent in Europe, it's a little more fragmented than the US. So the framework program that is pan-European and applying to all researchers in Europe represents about 6 to now 8% of all public R&D funding in Europe, while the federal investment in the US is about 98%. So, and then the final challenge that we also have in Europe is this ability to transform it into economic growth. And this is into, you can measure it into the development of new patents, etc. But at the end of the day, what you want is to see, the uptake of those technologies in the market and the ability for the economies to transform themselves to go into those growth sectors that are really driving the new economy. And there what you see is that when you look at the highest investors in R&D in the EU and in the US, what you see is that in 2003, more or less you had similar type of companies that were the heaviest investors. So it was on the automotive industry. So in Europe, you had Mercedes and you have Volkswagen. In the US, you have Ford and you have General Motors. Then you also have like some pharma, some electronics that were in the mix. When you look 20 years later, what you see is that in the US, the heaviest investors in R&D are completely different. So you have this rise of the new champions, let's put it that way, related to ICT, AI, etc., with Alphabet, with Meta and Microsoft, that are the heaviest investors in R&D, while in Europe you remain with the same type of companies. And this is a little bit a reflection on, a certain inability of Europe to create these new champions, these companies that are starting up their activities, but very quickly scaling up their activities to become these global giants in the world and that are driving many of the growth that is happening in Europe. We can have a discussion as well in terms of the distribution of all these benefits, but this is something that is happening and that is somehow holding back the European productivity. So that's a little bit in terms of a nutshell. So there can be 1,000 other statistics to present, what's the state of play of innovation in Europe. There are also the regional dimension in terms of, how this distribution of R&D is happening in Europe and in the US. But okay, it was just to give you a little bit of an overview, and we can go into the discussion to present, many more dimensions on that. So, okay, we acknowledge that Europe has a problem in terms of competitiveness. This is very much linked to its inability to transform good research into economic outputs. The question is, okay, what do we do? Do we have a plan? And the good news is that we do have a plan in Europe. So last year or 2 years ago in the EU, we developed what it was called the Competitiveness Compass, which is the roadmap that Europe has in order to improve competitiveness. It's very much linked to all the recommendations that we saw in the data report, and they are very much aiming at doing 3 things in general. So the first one is to improve the conditions, the framework conditions for this innovation and entrepreneurship for startups to transform, to become into scale-ups in Europe. So, and there we have different type of strategies like the EU Startup and Scale-up Strategy. We also have something that was adopted last week, that is how do you simplify the procedures for an innovative company to be able to act or operate across the European Union, so that, when a new company, a new innovative company files in, the register in Spain and then wants to start their activities or in France or in Germany, that they don't have to restart with the whole procedure and, all the administrative procedures in order to be registered in the different countries. So there's a proposal from the Commission, hopefully adopted soon, to create a unified regime for this type of companies that will allow them to only file all the administrative procedures. One, that should be done in less than 48 hours and fully electronically. So this is a quite game changer, we believe. We'll see in reality afterwards if that happens, but it's aiming at addressing that fragmentation of the EU market that many companies have. The second blocks of policies is related to the ability or the need to support companies to adopt these digital technologies that are supposed to transform the activities and the markets that they are operating in. So at the moment, we see that Europe, quite frankly, has lost a little bit the battle on developing the AI sectors. There are still areas that we are supporting, the European models to develop the AI models are behind many of the transformations. But what it is really important and where we expect the major productivity gains to come from is from the adoption of these technologies in all the different sectors. And this still is something that we are not seeing yet, or not to the extent that we would expect. And that would really kickstart productivity growth across the board. And it will provide also more distributed gains of those technologies across the board. And the third key area of activities is that we are supporting a little bit those sectors that we believe have the highest growth potential. It's a little bit like in the UK, the industrial strategy that they adopted in summer last year, focusing on those sectors where you think that growth will come. And here at the European level, what you have is action plans in sectors like quantum, advanced materials, biotech, robotics, or space technologies, because those are important sectors that will drive growth, and it will also help a little bit in diversifying the risks that we may have in terms of vulnerabilities with third countries. In addition to this type of policies, what we also have in the European Union is actually funding, so money, investments in R&D. So as I was mentioning before, the framework program for research and innovation in Europe currently has about 95 billion euro for 7 years. The new proposal of the European Commission is to increase that budget from 95 to 175 billion euros. So it's a significant increase in the actual budget of the EU that would be devoted to R&D. This, again, would represent only it's for 7 years. So if you remember the figure that I gave you in terms of the gap to reach the 3%, it would represent only barely 1 year of the money that would be needed to reach that target. So we would still need 6 times more that money at national investments in order to reach that investment gap. But it's not only the quantity of the money that we are providing, but it's also how this money will be invested. So to a large extent, we know that researchers and innovators need stability in their funding schemes. So pretty much we are following a similar model to what we have today, but there is a big difference in one particular area, which is the area where collaborative research is being carried out, where that part of the research program will be integrated in a larger program that will facilitate the whole innovation to investment journey, as we call it. So basically, it will be very closely linked to extra funding that would take the research outputs from the framework program and actually help them develop and implement and scale the results from those areas. And that's what you see there under the competitiveness link of Pillar 2 that will be they will be organized in 4 different windows, very much related to those growth areas that we believe are important for Europe. So one is clean tech. So we still need to ensure the green transition, the digital transformation, health, and all related areas related to health. And the fourth one, very importantly, the current context is about space, security, and defense. So we hope that that integration will help in getting better results, not only in terms of research, but also in terms of the actual uptake in the industry and in the economy. So this is a major transformation in the research program. And as I was saying, 175 billion in terms of the proposal, where a big chunk will be devoted to what we say is basic research, so excellence, curiosity-driven research, about 40% is related to this collaborative research also with industry that can be scaled up later on, and about 25% as well for supporting companies that have breakthrough innovations to start up in the market, but also to scale up their activities in Europe. Because so far we have too many European companies that start their activities in Europe, and when they start growing their activities, they actually move to the US because they have better access to capital, better access to talent, and better access to the market. So, of course, this is a financial part that, together with the policies that I was mentioning before, trying to address the fragmentation of the European market, will hopefully result in better results. So we have a plan. The question is, how far are we actually implementing this plan? Are we moving at the speed that we need? And well, here there are many different views. Officially, I'm going to say that we are moving at good speed, since this is being recorded, right? So we are moving at good speed. No, and truly, there's quite, I've been working for the European Commission for about 15 years. I've never seen such a frantic speed in terms of developing new initiatives. Sometimes maybe even too fast, I would say. But there is a lot of activity, and then, of course, there is the question of money. And here, once the Dragon report was launched, so former employer as well, the economists came up with that chart, with that image saying, yes, it's very good, all the ideas, but this will cost money, and money has to come from somewhere. And it's true that in Europe, just to give also a positive outlook, we have challenges, but we also have big assets. So we continue to have leading universities, talent. We also have a robust manufacturing sector, which is important for this transformation. So we have the foundations where we have to apply the new technologies, but we have the foundations. And also in terms of resources, we cannot forget that Europe is quite a rich continent. So we have about 35 trillion euro in terms of savings. That, of course, this is about 200% the GDP of Europe, that we need to mobilize in order to make it more productive. So it's not only on the savings account, but that it can be mobilized to go into these productive investments that Europe needs. But, okay, the question is, okay, how are we going to do all this? The spending capacity, the fiscal space of governments is a little exhausted because of all these multiple crises that Europe has had to do, that many times has been driven and facilitated by issuing public debt. So can we continue to do this or not? And this is a good question. For the moment, we have to see if there will be much more fresh money, but we all know that there are multiple competing uses of the available money for different uses. We all know that we have to increase our investment in defense. That will withdraw money. We also know that we have aging populations, so our welfare state needs to be supported. So will there be enough money for everything else? And then in terms of the level of implementation, so there is an annual report from the European Commission tracking, how much of these measures that we have put forward on the Competitiveness Compass are being implemented. So what we see is that several of them have been implemented. So we have made progress on reducing, the regulatory burden. So there have been quite pieces of legislation trying to reduce that. This is moving. We also see that many of the sectoral strategies for supporting the growth on sectors like quantum, AI, etc., have taken place. So investments associated to that are ongoing. We also know that there have been initiatives that are supporting the reducing the regulatory requirements for startups to take place, to address the fragmentation of the European research and innovation system, to make it less fragmented and better coordinated. So there are actions that are taking place in that field as well. But overall, there is a little bit of a general consensus that we are not moving fast enough. Also in Davos, so the German chancellor, during his speech, he mentioned that he thought that the rate of progress is not good in Europe. He mentioned the figure of 10% of all the commitments. From our accounts, it's a little more, but nonetheless still not sufficient. And perhaps what it is more important is that it's not the number of the percentage of measures, it's also the depth and importance of these measures. And in core areas where we would need to make significant progress, like reducing the fragmentation of the internal market in particular sectors, like services, professional services, etc., we are not quite just there. In terms of securing, deeper and more efficient capital markets that are more unified, that have more instruments that can mobilize these savings into the productive investments that we want, we are not there. And for that, it's not just coming up with a proposal from the Commission. There has to be political willingness also at member state level, because at the end of the day, the regulations or the legal measures that may facilitate all this need to be adopted by the member states, and this will require quite a lot of political courage. So the question is, do we believe that we are in such a state that will help us to mobilize all this move that is needed to go for this type of measures? Well, I think that we can have an interesting discussion there. And the final point that I wanted to share is about, like many of these measures will take time to bring results. We all know that you can have a legislation, but in order for it to have some effects on the ground, may take some time. So we need a little of time that we may or may not have, given the speed of the changes that are happening, with the technologies that are out there. So are we agile enough in order to adapt to these changes? And this is something that, again, the jury is a little bit out there. So this is a little bit what I had in store. So in a nutshell, just to summarize, yes, I think that we do have a competitiveness issue in Europe. I think that we really need to address it. I think that our levels of cholesterol are too high, and we start seeing, how this is affecting, our functioning. If we don't do anything, probably, the situation will get much worse, and this has consequences not only on the economy, but also in terms of the social model that we have in Europe, the political situation that we have. Probably we need changes, but probably without introducing these changes, we will go in a very dangerous direction in Europe. And for that, we need to act. There is a plan. There's a plan from the EU, but this has also need to come from the member states that are co-actors in transforming these changes. It has to come also from the private sector that has to act as well. And so what we have to do is to try to build the conditions, mobilize investments in order for this to happen, and we will need to do it at the speed that is needed. We continue to be in multiple crises. This should not deviate the attention of policymakers from what it is also important and urgent. So this is what I had. So thank you very much.
So let me just get the microphone, because I think we need the microphone. Thank you very much, Vinyat. That was very interesting and raising a lot of questions. In fact, more questions than answers. So now my question is for all of you. I think that Vinyat has raised a lot of issues, a lot of challenges. So who wants to break the ice and ask the first question? Yes. I'd like to say your name and where you belong to.
There's a song called I Belong to Glasgow. And hello, I'm Robert Pollock. I'm a visiting fellow with the Centre, looking at just transition, comparing oil and gas phase out in Scotland with coal transition in Spain and Asturias. I was delighted to hear you're an economic geographer, and there's quite a number of economic geographers in this room tonight. So I just quite like to get your view on how geography plays into this. So firstly, member states. Are there member states that are getting this right or are potentially getting it right? There's always, the pin-ups, 1 year it's Spain, the next year it's Estonia, et cetera, et cetera. But are there lessons that we can learn from certain member states? And then taking it down another level, regions. And I remember when the Draghi report came out, it was very much, it was praised by a number of economic geographers like Philip McCann, said, hold on, where's the spatial dimension in this? And Philip said, oh, we'll have more clusters, thank you very much. So I'd like your view, is that the solution at the regional level? More clusters, please.
Yeah.
What I come from the Basque country, so clusters is always an answer. No, but seriously. So the first question in terms of the regional dimension and the role of the states, of the member states. Well, the member states are fundamental in all this. They are driving the European agenda, so they need to come with the solutions that they think that it makes sense also at the European level. I think that the scale of the problem requires a little bit of this dual dimension. So on the one hand, you need to have the overall picture at European level, and I think that the agenda has concentrated perhaps too much at the macro level, if you want, and it's true that the regional dimension or the national dimension has been a little bit washed out, especially the regional dimension in all these plans. So the general line of thought is that for innovation is that we need to strike a balance between ensuring that we know that innovation concentrates in what they call spikes, areas of excellence, where naturally, the economies are concentrating. And at the same time, what you need to have are these nodes that relate the regional to these spikes. The question is that, okay, in terms of the model, this is okay. The question in reality is how do you actually ensure that? But for that, I think Andres is much better placed than me to answer. But this is a little bit the general thing. And it's true that, it has taken a very macro perspective in the sense that the center of analysis is really the EU as a unity, but knowing that there are strong diversities inside and how you can mobilize all this potential is still not 100% clear. And in terms of countries that may have done it right, I think in Europe at the moment we are all struggling a little bit. Also because we need the dimension of the European market.
Next question. Yes, Susanna.
Hello, thank you so much for the really inspiring talk. I have a long list of questions, so I'm just going to ask two very to the point. You mentioned financial markets. I'm working on state development banks and kind of their role, so I was interested to hear what do you think about this? Do they have a role in that? And the second one was skills and talent. When we speak about policy measures, I typically hear a lot about regulatory reforms. I don't hear so much emphasis on the skill side, so I'm just wondering what's your thought on that? Thank you.
Okay. I'll start with the second one because it's the easiest one. It's true that I haven't talked about skills, but it's a transversal element on everything. So as I was saying, probably in Europe, we still have the talent, luckily. So the question is also, how do we manage to maintain that talent so that it doesn't go elsewhere? And this is very much linked also with the potential. And I think that you need these sticky factors to continue to have the talent in Europe. And then for the national development banks, so like the British Business Bank or others, I think that they have a core role to play. I think that one of the key challenges that we see, especially for the scale-up companies that have riskier type of technologies and innovation solutions that they do not find the capital in the markets, at least in Europe. If there are not these type of actors, probably they will go to other geographies where they can tolerate higher risk because they have higher levels of investment portfolios, and therefore the risk is more mitigated. Therefore, I think that they have a very important role to play, and they are starting to play it actually. So many of the programs of the British Business Bank, for example, here in the UK, is supporting these scale-ups of risky technologies so that they can stay in Europe.
Thank you. So coming this way.
Hello, my name is Assad. I come from a different background, both culturally as well as professionally, from Saudi into healthcare. And I just wanted to talk regarding the startup culture and allowing it to thrive in any cultural or economic sense. The main kind of chokehold that stops startups, as you know, startups are very young in their either funding or their innovation, so they need allowing them to progress, and bureaucracy is a main kind of contributor to stopping any progress whatsoever. So from your understanding, what would be the main kind of solution in terms of breaking that bureaucracy, especially also in healthcare, but it can be also anywhere in any sector, just to break through that bureaucracy thinking, the traditional thinking of that countries and also policymakers are afraid of kind of going or trying new methods or trying new innovations. Technology is there, but the kind of commitment is not.
Okay. Vignette, your turn.
But I think that in terms of those cultural factors, in terms of the tolerance to risk and failure, I think that this is something that it has to be embedded a little bit in societies. I think that in general, so you can have it from the educational sector, so to be much more pro-risk if you want, but otherwise, once you have particular situations, so how you increase this tolerance to risk is by creating the factors that can help you to fail and do not have these consequences. So I think that many times when people are reluctant to this change is because they don't really know the consequences that it may bring, or the consequences that can bring are too severe. And that's something that you have to try to work from a regulatory perspective as well. So ensuring that a company, for example, that fails doesn't have consequences, long-lasting consequences for a founder. Or if you are talking about the health sector, you need to be able to assess very carefully what are the risks that may be associated with these innovations that you want to introduce. I mean, you always have to make a risk assessment and balance of benefits with the risks that are associated to that. And I think that that can help in taking better informed decisions that are against the no by default as a reply, because I don't understand what you are trying to do. I think the risks are too heavy. I don't know what will be the consequences. So I think that we need to embed that a little bit into the decision-making process.
Okay. Alex?
Good evening. Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. First, you mentioned that Europe has technology, it has know-how, but it cannot translate this know-how into actually productive processes. I wonder if you're familiar with the Italian IRI, I think is the abbreviation, where they set up an entity in the 20th century, and then they bought shares in industries, and then they bought a bit of shares in the industry, in the companies, and then they forced them to use better technologies in certain sectors. I don't know if that could be a model for the EU. That's one question. And then the second question is AI a heavy industry in your opinion, or is it a light industry? What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
The first one, to be honest, I'm not familiar with the model, but if I understand correctly, is that you are talking about the government taking stakes in companies and forcing them to take the innovations. Well, hopefully, if a company, in my view, but I may be tainted, but a company should look for ways to always improve its performance and adopt these technologies, whether the problem is that they don't have the resources to get it or they don't have the culture to do it. So if they cannot do it, they should disappear from the market. This is my opinion. I don't think that the government forcing an innovative culture in a particular company may be very successful. But I'm not familiarized with those models. Maybe there are examples where they have worked beautifully. But yeah, so, and then the second question is on AI, if it's a heavy industry. Well, I think AI with the data centers and the development of the data centers and what it requires in terms of energy consumption and all that, I think that you can consider them as some, relatively heavy industry. And in fact, for example, countries that are really betting on AI and establishing themselves because they have a lot of data in data-rich centers for the development of the industry, like it's the case of the UK, for example. If they don't have access to this energy that is associated to the maintenance of those centers, may actually face a big problem because many companies that may be willing to invest in the development of these centers may decide not to do it because they have an economic disadvantage because of the cost of energy. Yeah.
Okay, Lucas, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. My name is Lucas. I was interested in, so you laid out the plan that Europe has to address the innovation gap, this competitiveness compass with the four main policy areas. And I thought it was interesting, there was an emphasis on supporting startups, emphasis on big companies, supporting them adopt new tech. And then there was the one about rules and laws, simplifying them and supporting development of new technologies. I was just thinking, is there a reason why the sort of mid-sized or supporting startups persist and survive and grow, why that wasn't explicitly doesn't seem to be an explicit aim? And does that link to the issue that you talked about in the beginning of the problem with Europe being these small and mid-sized companies that don't invest in R&D and innovation stuff?
No, there is also a plan for mid-cap. I think it's at the end of the day what we need to support is the uptake of these digital technologies throughout the type of companies and sectors. Probably the ones that are suffering more are the SMEs because they have less capacity, less resources, less internal resources to adapt, obtain the technology and adapt their processes. But it's throughout, so the support is for all type of companies and all type of sectors. This is what we are aiming at, with a particular focus on some that have a higher profitability.
Any more questions? Yes.
Sorry, just add one more. So you mentioned that Europe is actually good at doing research, right? But the issue is kind of in the translation into productivity. Do you know whether Europe is doing research in the wrong areas? Are we too many social scientists and we need more hardcore scientists? So what's the issue there in comparison to the US? Do you have any view on that?
I'm a geographer, so I don't think that Europe is doing research on the wrong areas. I think innovation comes from bringing different knowledge together, including social sciences and humanities. So in that sense, I don't think that it's a problem of the type of research that we are doing. It's more how we are creating the conditions for this research to be uptaken and translated into innovation products, but also new type of companies. I think that this is a little bit where we are facing the problem. And it's something that is not new, but it has become much more acute now, especially because of the growth of those companies that have access to resources, that have access to markets that are fully integrated, and where they can scale up very quickly. I think it's more where the problem is, not so much on the type of research. And from the European perspective, just to leave it very clear, curiosity-driven research is a fundamental factor, because you never know how the different technologies are going to come up. So I don't think that Europe is doing research on the wrong side. Also the scale that we have allows us to actually have a very diversified type of research areas. So.
Okay, yes, Isabel.
Hello, my name is Isabel. So your talk is about reducing the competitiveness gap in Europe. And you touched briefly on this in your conclusion, but I'm curious to hear more about what the ultimate end goal is this for the EU, but also for the EU member states as well.
Prosperity and well-being. That's the final. But in more concrete terms, is that Europe can grow, can create the jobs of the future, and can create opportunities for everyone, especially from the young generations. I think that this is the end goal of boosting competitiveness.
Okay.
It's a quick one. It was a very thought-provoking, presentation, and I'm still thinking it through. But one of the slides that really struck me was the perseverance or the continuation of the dominance of automotive industries, in the European Union. And I think we all know that can be underplayed. It's a major engine of Central Europe. It was a huge industry in the integration of Central and Eastern Europe, huge industry in Southern Europe, Spain and Italy, etc. So I've been involved with coal phase out, and I know there's almost like a conveyor belt of industries that are going to go through a period of quite drastic transitioning. So what are your thoughts in terms of the automotive industry in Europe? Soft landing, hard landing? I appreciate your thoughts on that one.
Well, maybe two thoughts before I go into that. So the first one is, there's in itself, what I wanted to show with that is not that, the automotive industry continues to be the leading investor. I think this is good in order to facilitate this transformation. What I was mainly pointing out is that there are many other companies that are really growing and that we don't manage to get them in Europe. But it's really good that they continue to invest a lot in R&D in order to be competitive. Now, in terms of the state of play of the automotive industry in Europe, well, I think that there are two key challenges, in terms of the green and digital transformation, where they need to come up to speed. And I think that the speed of the transformation of the industry may not have been similar to what we see in other latitudes, either on the green, also for the type of cars that maybe we need in terms of the population, also for, not super expensive electrical vehicles, but also in terms of the digitization of the industry. I think that maybe we will need to accelerate a little bit the changes that are happening in the industry. It is a core sector in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of employment. I cannot really assess whether it would be a hard landing or a soft landing. I hope for a soft landing.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take my privilege. Oh.
We have a question from the YouTube streaming. Well, I guess it's doing one. It says, do you see homegrown AI in the future?
Do I see?
Homegrown
AI. And then, do you think Europe would be interested in such investments if it weren't for the current geopolitical tension with the US?
Well, I do hope that there is AI growth in Europe. There are quite a lot of research teams working on that. It's true that, the current situation vis-a-vis the US is that, at least on the LLM models, we have a gap, we are late. But let's see on the new models that are coming on AI. And then do I see that, of course, the current situation, when I was talking about dependencies that become vulnerabilities, so this is one potential one. I think that, we still will continue to cooperate with the US. But yeah, I think that we need to see if they can develop their own models that are competitive enough with the US. Again, that will require significant investment levels when you compare it with the resources that large companies in the US have, way beyond public budgets of any particular state. It might be challenging, and also we need that these companies have the market integrated in Europe so that they can also scale up their activities.
Okay, sorry, Lenny. No.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation. A notable pattern that we see in Europe is basically European startups receive early stage investment in Europe, and then when they scale up, they move to the US in order to, with this relocation, to get access to a better market, capital markets, and more favorable ecosystem in general. I was wondering, what are the specific steps or ways we can overcome these challenges? And also, a subsequent question: how do you think, the patent protection strategies might play a role in this? Europe is lagging in these indicators, especially in comparison with the US. I would like to hear that.
So I think that's, how to address the issue of why Europe doesn't have the scale-ups, but we have the startups. There's no silver bullet. I think that you're required, at least, from our perspective, all these set of actions that will allow to Europe to improve the situation. On the one hand, skills and talent, so that I didn't mention it, but definitely it's one. You need to be able to, for these companies to have access to that capital that currently they cannot find in Europe, because the venture capital markets are not as developed or as deep as they are in the US, so they cannot access these amounts of capital, and they need to prove much more. And then you need an improvement on the regulatory environment in order to be able to scale up in Europe, so that they can find this ability to scale without going through too many bureaucratic procedures. So this is a little bit what we, as a strategy, but in Europe we are trying to do. And the second one, in terms of the patents and the patent protection.
How important is to facilitate the patent protection in Europe instead of moving in order to do it in?
Well, I think that, for a company to, when they want to do R&D and to be able to monetize the investments that they are doing, they need to have, this protection on their knowledge. But I think in Europe, the protection of the patents are quite good. I think that is not the biggest issue.
As far as I know, for example, on patenting in the US, it's much more straightforward. It's much easier than, let's say, with the USPTO. Than into, let's say, to patent the group of countries in Europe.
Yeah, in general, this type of companies, when they try to patent, they go for global patent schemes, either PCT or triadic. So in US, EPO, and Japan. So in principle, when we talk to companies, they don't see this as the biggest handicap that they face. So for them, it's really access to funding, partners on the market, and of course, talent. That for me, it goes without saying.
Okay, I'm going to take the privilege of being the host to ask a few questions, hopefully just three. But this is an important topic, and you started on a good note and very positive. The idea is that Europe has a diagnosis: we're not competitive, and we're not competitive because we don't innovate enough, and it has a plan. So we have a roadmap of where we want to go. But my question is it the right roadmap? Is it the right plan? And I'm going to try to say why. Elaborate a bit more. You put the compass, which is the competitiveness compass, which is something that we probably all agree with, but you forgot about the new proposal for the budget, which is what Europe needs to do in terms of investment and what sort of, let's say, innovation policy that is linked to an industrial policy. And there, the whole idea, coming virtually from the Draghi report, is let's build what we don't have. Europe doesn't have the top technological companies. We don't have a Meta, we don't have an OpenAI, we don't have Anthropic, we don't have Microsoft, we don't have Oracle, and then therefore we need to replicate that. But the question is, can we really replicate that when we are so much behind China and we are so much behind the US? And with the budgets that are being put on the table, remembering that OpenAI, the leader at the moment, but a company that many are predicting that it might fail very soon, has raised in the last 3 months $110 to $120 billion and close to $180 billion in the last year and a half.
So I think that there are two questions there. Right? So the first one, do we have the right roadmap? And you link that question to the belief that we need to replicate, these global champions that the US have and that we don't have in Europe. I think that we don't need to replicate the same type of companies. I think that what we need to replicate is the conditions that allow these type of companies to emerge. And this can be on many different sectors. It doesn't have to be AI per se, although of course there's a strong focus on AI because we believe that is, what is going to allow the transformation of our economies and also, leads to, the geopolitical context so that we need to address a little bit those vulnerabilities. But I think, what we are trying to do is more creating the conditions for these companies to emerge rather than trying to replicate the companies that we don't have in Europe at the moment. I think that it would be, we cannot compete to create, a new Google or a new Meta in those particular sectors. But maybe we can do it in other type of sectors that can be there. And then in terms of the budget, do we have enough resources in the European budget? I was mentioning a little bit, the increase of the budget for research and innovation and the link with, with this new competitiveness fund that is trying to deploy. It's also true that, the resources at the EU level are what they are. So it's about 1% of the GDP of the EU. This is, of course, not sufficient. And we need to mobilize, these investments at member state level. And I'm not talking about the public investment, but also, all this wealth of savings that exist in Europe in order to be able to mobilize towards those productive investments. There are still too many savings that are not really mobilized. A little bit linked to the cultural factor that we are risk averse in Europe in general. And about the OpenAI and the ability of AI companies to raise funding in the US pretty much, with a short presentation of less than 20 minutes, and that in Europe it requires, complete business plans, etc. Well, it's maybe the beauty of the US, but it's also the risk, and we continue hearing, that there might be a burst of the AI bubble, and that many of these companies will get busted, but investors still invest. So I think that it's a question of the risk management of the portfolio of activities that they have.
Well, you addressed my third question, which was about resources, but let me just go to the second question. That in this plan, we're looking at what we don't have and what we would like to have. And what, as you said, is very unlikely that we're going to get because we are, in some cases, far behind. Why is no one really talking about what we really have? In fact, in this century, Europe has been the pioneer in rolling out the vaccines with BioNTech, not one of the largest companies by any means, small spin-off from a medium-sized, medium-ranked university in Germany, in Mainz in this case. We got the base of the AI revolution with the lithography machines that are produced by ASML, which is possibly now the largest company in Europe. That can create a bottleneck. We are leading in many areas of medicine or biochemistry. I'm thinking about Novo Nordisk with Ozempic and all the other diabetes and drugs. And also we have quite a lot of hidden champions that are high tech, medium tech, and in some cases low tech that are at the forefront. Why are they not appearing in the strategy, in the roadmap anywhere? And why are we trying to replicate what we don't have and not reinforce, transform, and reinvent ourselves on the basis of what we have, when we know that in the past, every time we have tried to do something ex novo from nothing, it has rarely worked. And when we build on what we have to transform it and reinvent ourselves, it normally works much, much better.
Well, I think that's maybe, it's true that the discourse that is coming out, it's very much focused on the negative side and what we are missing. I think that in the analysis, all those factors that you have mentioned, what we have, the capacities, the talent, the type of companies, these hidden champions, in particular sector, these SMEs that continue to be very productive, etc. I think that they are acknowledged and recognized, but I think that it's also a little bit the discourse to create this momentum of urgency that we really need to do something, that we put the attention on your analytics of your blood test, and you look at the cholesterol, and that you are really looking into this. Again, I think that, or at least from my perspective of my reading of the strategies that we have in the Compass, is not so much about replicating what we don't have. It's true that there is a lot of emphasis on what we don't have, why we don't have. Why don't we have Google? Why Europe is unable to do that? But I think that when you look at the development of the different actions, it's more about what are the reasons why we didn't get it to this Google, not so much why don't we have Google. So that's why I think that the strategies and the investments are much more geared in creating these better conditions for ensuring that these type of companies can emerge in Europe. So, okay. But I understand that there might be different views, including what's happening with the green transition.
Thank you very much.
For another moment.
Thank you very much, Beñat. I think we have squeezed you more than enough, but I think you raised a lot of questions and challenged us to a very interesting debate. So I would like to thank you, and I hope we can thank you all in the usual way. So. Many thanks to all of you for coming, to all of you online for actually following our events at the Cañada Blanc Center. This is the last event this term, but we'll have more next term with new fellows, new ideas, new invited speakers. So I would encourage all of you to follow us both on LinkedIn and on X, to go into our web page here at the LSE. And if you want to look at what we have done in the past, look at our library of events and presentations, which appears on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much. And please enjoy this wonderful Thursday evening here in London. Thank you.